welcome to our November Native American History Month presentation of Ethnobotany, If Plants Could Talk, a Cherokee Relationship. We're very fortunate today to have with us Tony Harris. Mr. Harris is a recognized Cherokee elder for his work in preserving the Cherokee history and culture here in Georgia. Tony is passionate about preserving his heritage, especially the use of native plants for food, medicine, weapons, tools, and ceremonial purposes. His personal garden contains many of the plants used by the Cherokee prior to the time of the Trail of Tears. Tony is a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. He has spoken at the National Cherokee Ethnobotany Conference and the National Park Service, and he has received the Conservation Award presented by the Daughters of the American Revolution. To learn more about his work, please visit mycherokeegarden.com. Thank you so much, Tony, for joining us today. Welcome to Gwinnett County Public Library.
Well, good morning. I am honored to be able to speak to you today about a topic that I feel very passionate about. It's I titled this presentation, Ethnobotany, If Plants Could Talk, a Cherokee Relationship. And ethnobotany simply means the study of plants that are significant to a particular ethnic group. In this case, it was the Cherokee Indians. The Cherokees lived very close to the earth, and they relied on these plants for survival, for food, medicine, shelter, tools, weapons, for hundreds and even thousands of years, even before the Trail of Tears. I want to talk a little bit about how the Cherokees changed plants into medicine. The first way they did this was through what was known as a decoction. That's where the plant material is placed in a large amount of water, which is partially boiled away, and then that water was then used as medicine. They also did a steep or an infusion. That's where the plant material is shredded or pounded and soaked in cold water. And then they also made what's known as a poultice. That's where they take plant material prepared in several different ways and wrap it in cloth, and a dampened cloth, and apply it to the affected part of the body. And then they also boiled plant material for a short time in water as opposed to the decoction. But they also took much of their medicine in the form of tea, different types of teas. In most cases, they would drink the tea, but sometimes they would apply it to the spot that was ailing. And sometimes they would take a sharp instrument like the thorns of a devil's walking stick, which is a plant that has very thorny, sharp thorns, scratch the skin and then apply the tea on that to help it be absorbed into the skin. The first plant I want to talk about today is called bloodroot. The bloodroot, the flowers were pollinated by flies and bees, but the seeds ripen before the foliage goes dormant, and this plant does go dormant in the summer. It'll seem like it disappears, but it's really just sleeping. It's underground. The roots are still alive. But the seeds ripen before the foliage goes dormant, and those seeds have an orange coating on them called elastisome, which ants love to eat, and they'll take that down into their colonies and eat that coating off and leave the seed to germinate. Now you have to just in your mind's eye, if you could imagine an ant colony, the ant hill is the soil is very loose. They've taken the seed down into that loose soil. They provide fertilizer in the form of the waste from the ants, and then all that's needed is rainfall, and then you see this plant do something that we call colonizing. That means it naturally spreads from spreads out. It gets bigger and larger each year. Color of this plant, if you break the root open, when that moisture comes in contact with the air, it turns blood red. And the Cherokees would use this red coloring as a dye, both for baskets or clothing or whatever. And every color had a significance to the Cherokee. And red was a sign of success. And that's one of the reasons why much of the chief's clothing is in red, and much of the artwork that the Cherokees perform is in red as well. The roots were used for cough medicine and also for eye ailments. The roots were also used to treat poison ivy. If poison ivy or poison oak, they would take that liquid from the root, rub that on the affected area, and it would dry it up. The tubers were also used as an insect repellent, and a very effective one at that. And it likes moist, well-drained soils and part to full sun. Now, the sanquinolene that this plant contains is an antiseptic and was used on cold sores, poison ivy, and warts. Okay, the mayapple, and it goes by several different common names. Some people call it hog apple or Indian apple, mayflower, and even umbrella plant. And the reason they call it umbrella plant is if you look at the shape of the leaves, when they're in the summertime, when they're leaved out, it looks like a small umbrella. So it went by that common name as well. Now, the flowers on this plant provide the sexual reproduction, and the rhizomes provide the asexual reproduction or dispersal and cluster growth. In other words, the roots would go out from a plant and produce other plants the next year. The Cherokees used it to promote vomiting, and that was one of the ways the Cherokees, one of the methods the Cherokees used to cleanse the body of any unwanted ailments or complaints. It was also used as a stool softener, and also a treatment for worms. Now, you did not use the root joints or the leaf joints because they are very poisonous, but the parts of the roots between the joints were used for the medicine. Now, the flowers fork out from the stem from the mayapple, which appears in July and August. Okay, the next plant I want to talk about is wild ginger. And this is significant because it was used in so many of the Cherokee formularies. The Cherokees, when they named plants, they didn't use like one or two words. Oftentimes, they would use descriptive phrases. And in Cherokee, the name for this plant translates the mule's footprint or big stretch. And the reason for that is that if a mule were to stick their hoof in the mud and pull it back out, the shape that would be left in the mud looks just like the shape of the leaves on this plant. So every Cherokee knew the mule's footprint. They knew what plant that was. And as I say, this was used probably in 80% of the Cherokee formularies. And it wasn't like, I mean, I've identified over 500 plants they use just for medicine, plants and or trees, but it wasn't like they would take one plant and necessarily make a medicine. Sometimes it was a combination of 2, 3, or 4 different plants, and that you can see how complex that can become. And that's the reason why it takes anywhere from 15 to 20 years to become a competent medicine man or medicine woman. And oftentimes why it ran in families, because the children were exposed to it and they could pick up on it, and they just grew up with it. It became second nature. They used this plant to make a medicine for indigestion. And they also use it as a kidney medicine. And they use it as a tonic for endurance for the upcoming harvest. Now you got to realize the average farm in Cherokee farm in Georgia prior to the Trail of Tears was 10 to 12 acres. They're very agriculturally oriented prior to the Trail of Tears. They had vegetable gardens, they had orchards, they had smokehouses, they had animals, some of them brought over through Savannah and Augusta ports, chickens. They had cows, hogs, horses. Uh, some of them even had bees. And so when they were ready to harvest corn, they would take this tonic for endurance because they would help each other bring in the crops each year and put it in their storage rooms. Wild onion. Wild onion is in actually the lily family, and I'm sure that some of you have seen this grow in your yard or your garden, and you look at it as a weed. But the Cherokees used it as a food, and it can be added to any food. Now, my mother, when I was growing up, would send me out to gather up wild onions and also poke when it was about 5 or 6 inches tall. But she would take the wild onions and scramble them in eggs. And you got to think of it in terms of like a little stronger version of chives. Now, when I was growing up in the Cherokee Nation, the supermarkets or stores there, you could go to the produce department and they would sell wild onions in bunches like you would buy chives. And so it was very much a spring type, April, May especially. They have a wild onion festival in Oklahoma. And it's a big deal. They even have a Miss Wild Onion. And before we think that's funny, it's really very serious because the winner gets a college scholarship. And so if you want to know more about the Wild Onion Festival, just Google Wild Onion Festival, Oklahoma, and you can read about how the Cherokees and other Native American tribes use the wild onion as food. Now, they would take this in the form of a tonic. They make a tonic out of this to clean the system out. Now, you want to remove the shuck at the base of the plants. In other words, the only part of this plant you want to use is the dark green tops. You don't want to use any of the white that goes close to the ground. That's called a shuck. Now, they use this tea and tonics to make to treat colic and croup and hives and colds and sore throat and liver complaints, and it's harvested in April and May. Now, I want to say something about this. As we go through this, I may be saying things like the Cherokees use this to treat kidney medicine, kidney diseases, or lung diseases, or cancer, or whatever. Or high blood pressure, and you're probably thinking, how did they know they had that? But what you have to realize that is that even today in the Cherokee Nation, I would say 40% of the Cherokees still practice plant medicine to one degree or another. Some of them will use plant medicine or the medicine men or women and go to a regular doctor as a last resort. My mother practiced plant medicine on me when I was growing up, and a lot of what she gave me was in the form of teas. And I've got to tell you, some things taste better than others, but you never refused or said no because you had a respect for your elders. The black walnut is the next tree I want to talk about. And it's very significant. Juglans nigra, an infusion of the inner bark was taken for smallpox. Now, this is very significant. You need to know that prior to the Trail of Tears, there were 2 outbreaks of smallpox, epidemics of smallpox within the Cherokee Nation when they were back east here. It's something that Europeans brought over that Native Americans had no immunity to whatsoever. And it was estimated that each of those 2 epidemics killed half of the living Cherokees at that time. Each epidemic did. So it decimated the population of the Cherokees. So they had to find something to treat the smallpox with. And this was one of the plants they found would help in the treatment of smallpox. And by the way, the Cherokees shared their medicinal plant knowledge with the Europeans. Now, the bark was used cautiously because it can be poisonous. And the bark was chewed for toothaches. If you had a toothache, you could chew the bark and it would help relieve that. And the sap was used as an antiseptic for things like ringworm or mild infection or whatever, kind of like you would methylate, if you know what that is. But a poultice was made from the black husk. You know, when a walnut drops from the tree, the husk turns black. And a poultice was made from the husk to aid. Again, if this is a poultice, is where they take this black husk, put it in a rag, dampen it, and place it on the affected part of the body. They would do that. They'd place it on a newborn baby's belly button to promote it dropping off. And of course, the nuts, I love black walnuts. The nuts were used as food as well. And now the black husk was also used to make a dark brown dye. And if you've ever taken a black walnut and stripped that black husk off the outside of the nut itself, your hands are black and you don't wash that off. I mean, it is truly a black dye. And so they would use that to make a black dye for both basket weaving or clothing or whatever. Now, they would also make a green dye from the juice of the leaves. Now, the Cherokees also fished with the black walnut. They would take those black walnuts and that husk, they would shuck the black husk off the nut and put those husks into a container, fill that container with water, and basically let it ferment. And then they would go out to a lake or a stream where there wasn't a lot of current, but they knew there were fish, and they would dump that slurry into the water, and it temporarily shocks the fish. It's like telephoning them, if you know what that means. They temporarily float to the top. It doesn't poison them, it just shocks them. And they would either net them and throw them out on the bank or gig them and throw them out on the bank. And the Cherokees never wasted anything. What they didn't eat that day, they would take back and clean and hang in their smokehouses, so they would have that for food at a later date. Now then, the picture you see on this slide is a Cherokee fish trap, and it's on the Toccoa River on the way to McKaysville from Blue Ridge. And this was taken from a train that goes right along the river as you go up there. What the Cherokees would do is they'd take stones and they would make a little dam. Now, right here, the water's pretty high. Normally, it's not quite this high, but it would cause the fish to go down into a very small area, and then they could gig them or net them and harvest them that way as well. Now, the wood is very hard, and the Cherokees made gigs from the wood. And even today, they make airplane propellers out of it. But juglone is a substance that this tree emits, both from the root system and also the drip line from the leaves. And it you don't want to plant a vegetable garden close to a black walnut tree because it will kill tomatoes and apples and potatoes. It'll even kill conifers. Uh, and if you notice in a black walnut, there's hardly anything that grows under a black walnut. There may be a little bit of a few strands of grass here and there, but this is a very selfish tree. It wants all the nourishment, it wants all the moisture, and this juglone is one of the ways it eliminates its competition in both of those areas. Um, it likes full sun, moist and well-drained soils, and can reach 130 feet tall. And the black walnuts can live as long as 250 years. Now, I mentioned they use this for fishing. They also would use the roots of the buckeye. They would grind those roots up, put it in like a burlap sack, and sink that in the water, and it would shock the fish as well, and they'd come floating to the top. Now, both of those are highly illegal. Even within the Cherokee Nation, because that's called harvesting fish. But that's how they that was one of their food sources, and they didn't waste anything. Okay, the next plant I want to talk about is called sweet everlasting. Some people call it rabbit tobacco. It's Pseudonaphthalium obtusifolium. And again, the descriptive name, the Cherokee name for this plant translates ash-like, because if you look at the picture of the plant, both the aerial parts of that plant, both the stems and the flowers are all ashen in color. And so they called it ash-like, and all Cherokees knew what that was. Now, the Cherokees would make a tea from these aerial parts of the plant, and it was used to treat flu and colds. And they would also use it as a tea, as a preventative prior to the flu season, cold season. But also they would make a cold infusion from the aerial parts of the plant and use it as a skin astringent. It's even more effective than witch hazel. And then finally, the tops were used as air fresheners. When this blooms, it's very fragrant. And the Cherokees would take this and clip the tops off and take it into their log cabins. By the way, they didn't live in teepees. They lived in log cabins here. And they would take these into their log cabins, and it would freshen the air for 2 to 3 months. And some theorize that that's how it got its nickname, Sweet Everlasting. But it grows in full sun and often found in meadows. Now, we have a lot of this growing at the Cherokee Garden and Green Meadows Preserve in Cobb County. And it's up in the meadow area, and it's a very, it seeds back every year. It comes back from seeds. And now, the inner bark of this tea was used for vomiting in children, not to cause vomiting, but to treat vomiting. They'd make a tea, and that would help the children overcome their tendency to want to vomit. Now, a bark poultice was used for sore and swollen muscles. Again, that's wrapped in cloth, dampened, the bark is, and then placed on those sore or swollen muscles. And a poultice of the scrape bark was used to treat burns. Now, the bark was chewed for stomach trouble and high blood pressure. And a tea was made from the inner bark and leaves and used as a stimulant. Next slide. Now, it's found in moist soil under forest canopies or close to streams. This particular picture is taken in our lower garden at our residence, and you can see it's growing in dapple sun and it's very happy. The blooms on this are so tiny, Danny. The blossoms are large, but the little blooms within that cluster are so small and pure white. They're just magnificent. And during the growing season, the stem bark tends to peel off in several layers and colors. And hence it gets its name, the seven bark hydrangea. And of course, everybody knows that arborescence, hydrangea arborescence simply means becoming tree-like because as it gets older, it becomes more woody. Rattlesnake master. And there are two versions of this in Georgia. The one that grows along the coastal area is the aquifolium, but the one that grows in northern Georgia, basically north of the Chattahoochee River, which was Cherokee land, is the yuccifolium, and that's the one that the Cherokees would have related to. It's actually in the parsley family, and it grows to about 3 feet tall. And when it blooms, it has a beautiful, tall, beautiful bloom that shoots up from the center of the plant. And the Cherokee name for this plant translates a little base of mother corn that encompasses all. And you're saying, what does that mean? But if you look at the plant, look at the leaves, they look very similar to the leaves on the corn stalks. So again, descriptive, a little base of mother corn, and often the Cherokees would refer to corn as mother corn because it was so basic in the Cherokee diet. And it encompasses the entire plant. So a little base of mother corn that encompasses all. That was their descriptive name for this plant. But it was called a warrior's plant, and also it was a survival kit. There was buttons on the roots of this plant that hunters would carry on their person when they were hunting because they felt that if they had that on their person and they came across a snake, the snake would crawl away from them. They also used it as a remedy if they suffered a snake bite. They would take that button root and chew it up, swallow about half of that material, and place the rest of that chewed up material on the snake bite itself to treat it. And the root tentacles are also known to inhibit cancer. So it's a very unusual plant, but one that has a long history with the Cherokees. And again, the blossoms on this plant was used to help in aiding the belly button on newborn babies dropping off. They'd make a poultice out of this as well. Maple leaf viburnum was taken for smallpox. Again, the importance of finding treatments for smallpox was so vital because of the number of deaths that the Cherokees suffered from this disease they had no immunity to. It did several things. That tea they made was would promote sweating, but the tea also would reduce fever. And the tea infusion was also taken to prevent spasms. All three of those you would find if you had smallpox, you would have all of those. And it treated all three of those symptoms. So it was very vital in the medicinal category. The fruits bear what's known as black drupes. And I'm often asked, well, what's a drupe? Well, you know, some native plants have round black berries, like the arrowwood viburnum, little round blackberries. Well, these berries on this plant are called drupes, and they are in the form of a pear, and they can be up to a half-inch long, and so they are a little unique in that sense. They grow 3 to 6 feet tall. and it tolerates full to partial shade. Now, this picture uh, is taken again in our lower garden on a slope, on a bank. And the reason for that is that they like medium moisture and well-drained soils. They don't like to keep wet feet, so to speak, or wet roots. And so it's very happy there. You can see where the color of the leaves, the shape of the leaves, the all dark green. Is a very happy plant and likes where it's growing. Sunchoke. It's also known as Jerusalem artichoke. And it's not an artichoke. The tubers or the roots were eaten, and the tubers look very similar in shape and appearance to ginger roots. And the Cherokees used it like you would potatoes and harvested in the spring and fall. Next slide. And it could be eaten raw, boiled, or like in a soup or whatever. Eaten raw, I defy you to tell the difference between this, the taste and texture of this, and the taste and texture of water chestnuts. Very, very similar. The composition itself, the Cherokees cultivated them as far back as 1500. When I say cultivated, I mean fields full of this. The tubers were 10% protein and about 76% carbohydrates. And but they are invasive. Now then, if you want something really delicious, you can take these and either use them in stir fry like you would water chestnuts, or you can make a soup out of them, boil it, make a soup, and then put a little half and half in there, and you know those little immersion blenders, blend it up where it's nice and smooth, and then take wild onions, the dark green part, and chop some of those up on top, and that's delicious. That's a Cherokee dish. Goes back a long way. And now, one of the things I wanted to mention about this, when I started my blog, I didn't realize how far things went on the internet. And I use WordPress so people can communicate back to me. And I've gotten responses from all over the world. I did a posting on Jerusalem artichoke, sunchoke one time, and about an hour later, I get a response from a lady in Hanoi, North Vietnam, and she was a chef, and she wanted to know more about the plants that Cherokees use for food because she was very interested in it. Now, sunchoke today in the big fancy restaurants, if you can find some that are open, is the cat's meow. I mean, it is the thing on the menu. And so it's eaten today. In fact, I was in Kroger the other day and saw some sunchoke roots for sale right next to the ginger. So it's another lady in Montreal, Canada, a veterinarian, emailed me back, and she was interested in the medicinal plants because she practices nothing but plant medicine on animals, and the Cherokees did too. And so she was very interested in that. I'm going to shift gears a little bit here and talk about a plant that is more spiritual in nature to the Cherokees, and that is the Eastern red cedar. The elders in the tribe use it for purification purposes. They would take the leaves and burn them, and they would use that smoke much like you would incense to convey requests and prayers. And it has a juniper oil smell because it is a juniper. It's not a true cedar. It is a juniper. The oldest tree, and this is interesting, this is as of about 4 years ago, The oldest tree, this specimen they found in the U.S. is in Missouri, and they estimated at that time it was 795 years old. So it's a very long-lived tree. Now, the Cherokees also made poles from the wood to mark agreed upon hunting territories. If you saw juniper stake in the ground, every other Cherokee knew that that was someone else's hunting ground. Now, those blue cones you see growing there on the plant were used to make a kidney medicine. And I will say this, we had one of these growing when I was growing up in our yard, and you learn real quick, you don't walk around that tree barefooted because these things are like metal jacks, like you play jacks with a ball. I mean, they're hard and they're sharp. The next plant I want to talk about is tobacco. It's the Nicotiana rustica. And this actually is a plant that originated in Central America. But you got to realize there were trade routes through Central America up into the Americas for many hundreds of years. And this is one of the plants that Cherokees adopted. It was forbidden to use it to smoke or chew. You wouldn't really want to. Because regular tobacco is like a 1 to 3% nicotine level. This is like 9%. And so it would too, was burned, the leaves were burned, and the smoke was used as like you would incense to convey requests and prayers. Now, it was also, the leaves were ground up and carried in pouches on the hunters' persons to help them convey requests and prayers as well during the day. It's easy to grow, and believe it or not, it's closely related to the tomato family. The prairie willow, the Salix humilis, and this is a very special plant. This specimen we have in the Cherokee Garden at Green Meadows Preserve in Cobb County is probably the only specimen of this plant in the southeastern United States. There is one county in Tennessee and one county in Kentucky where you might, at least at one time in the past, have found it. Now, I'm a close friend of the Director of Natural Resources for the Cherokee Nation. We trade plants back and forth. And he hunted for 7 or 8 years in the Cherokee Nation for this and finally found it. I was able to talk him out of a specimen. And of course, the Cherokee name for this is redroot. But there's also legends about this plant. The Cherokees called it the plant that walks. And the reason for that is that it has a very aggressive rhizome roots. So it can be growing here this year, but the roots can go over here and develop another plant additionally over here next year. But to get from here to here, it had to walk. So they referred to it as the plant that walks. They used it in stomp ground activities. And this is activities that would go well into the night or all night sometimes. This is important. You could take 2 or 3 of the leaves off of this plant if you had a toothache and chew them, and it's like giving yourself a shot of Novocaine. It really will deaden your entire mouth. And so the Cherokees would use it that way to treat toothache. But they also used it to make teas for fever and colds and pains and flu and so forth, even prior to 1700. And then in the 1860s, there was a little German company that started studying the willow. And they synthesized what was naturally taking place in the plant and developed a product called aspirin, salicylic acid. That's where aspirin comes from. It came from, the synthesis of that. And so the Cherokees were using it correctly. And they were using this even prior to 1700. Now, in your better skin creams, sometimes you can find, if you look on the ingredients, if it says it has salicylic acid, that has aspirin. In other words, that cream you're using, skin cream, is like a topical aspirin as well. It has a healing effect to it. But the bark was used as a poultice for skin ailments. And also, one other thing the Cherokees did, they made a cold infusion of these leaves to promote hair growth. And I've never seen a bald-headed Cherokee. And but they used it to promote hair growth as well. Okay. And this is the last plant I want to talk about today, is shagbark hickory. And shagbark hickory, WALNUT, was used to make bows and tools and furniture and stickball sticks. Stickball was a huge game played by the Cherokees well, they still play it. But they played a lot of it in North Georgia in an area known as Ball Ground, Georgia. And but it was used to make stickball sticks because it's very hard. And so it is, would it be for bows and tools and furniture. But it was the firewood of choice for smokehouses to smoke meats of all types, because it had a low, slow burn with a very fragrant smoke taste. So it was the wood of choice for that. Now, the Cherokees also made a shagbark hickory syrup, and I have some of this, and it's very light in color, very sweet, and they would use that to make jams and jellies out of wild berries and so forth they found in the woods. And the nuts on this tree are very oily, and the Cherokees would crush those nuts to make cooking oil. Now, the nuts called soy was used to make a winter food that was like a paste. In Hawaii, they would refer to that type of paste as a poi. But the inner bark makes a tea used to treat colds and fever. Now, this tree has shaggy bark hanging from the outside, but when the tree is younger, it's a smooth bark. And until it reaches, depending on the pH of the soil and the soil itself, it may be 7 or 8, 10 years before it starts developing this real shaggy bark look on the outside. And the only way you can tell this hickory from other hickories is that the shagbark hickory, as you see in the picture here, has 5 leaflets on each leaf. And that's how you tell if that's a shagbark hickory. I just want to tell you, we're duplicating this Cherokee garden that we have in Cobb County in the Cherokee capital in Tahlequah. It's located at the tribal complex called Salagi. And about a third of the plants the Cherokees used back east are not readily available in Oklahoma. And that the Cherokee Nation is the 14 counties in northeast Oklahoma. Even though the planting zones are very close together, in fact, in Tahlequah, you'd swear you were in North Georgia. It's the foothills of the Ozarks. And so they would tell me what they'd like to have, and we drive them out there and help them plant them in that garden. And this is Pat Gwynn. I was telling you about, the Director of Natural Resources, doing a little tour there. They have a stream that goes through their garden there. And this is Feather. And Feather is a caretaker of the garden. And the last time I was out there, Feather and I were walking through the garden, And she said, some of these plants Feather, some of these plants we brought out here are doing better here than they did back in Georgia. And she said, well, I just love autumn. And then one of the plants they don't have out there is a tulip poplar, even though that's the state tree of Tennessee. And she asked me when I took it out there about 4.5 years ago, I drove it out in my van and I had it in a 5-gallon bucket. I was standing up in the back of my van. So you can see it wasn't really tall. And so we planted it right along that creek there. And when I was out there this past year, it has to be 40 foot tall. And she asked me, and it's going to drink a lot of that water out of the stream. She asked me, she said, how big does this tree get? And I said, Feather, it's going to be bigger than anything you have ever seen in Oklahoma. And she said, well, that's what I thought. But anyway, that gives you a little idea of we wanted to have a garden on each end of the Trail of Tears. The Cherokee Garden at Green Meadows Preserve is an interpretive site on the Trail of Tears National Historic Trail. And it's open 7 days a week, sun up to sundown. It's free of charge. It's a county park. And we have 14 master gardeners who maintain that garden every Thursday. In the last 4 years, we've had over 4,000 volunteer hours in that garden. So I hope this whets your appetite just a little bit about Cherokee plants and how close the Cherokees live to the earth and still do. So any questions?
Tony, I was just curious. You talked about the black walnut and that the Cherokee would make gigs. What are gigs?
Gigs are poles that are very sharp, honed on the end, that you can either gig fish or frogs or anything like that. They're spears. That's what they are. They're spears.
That makes great sense. And that was fascinating, what you shared about smallpox, and also the prairie willow and aspirin. That was really surprising.
Yeah.
We think
if you look at the pharmacy shelves today, all those bottles up there, I would say in one way or another, probably 80% of them can, in one way or another, be traced back in some way to plants.
Wow, absolutely. Well, everyone, please visit mycherokeegarden.com.
Yes.
More about Tony Harris's work, and we're very grateful that you took the time today, sir, to come and talk with us.
And if anybody is in the Marietta area, the Cherokee Garden at Green Meadows Preserve is on Dallas Highway. It's at the 3780 Dallas Highway, Marietta.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.